When we filter data, we sometimes then want to see different aspects of the data, such as a sum of the data or perhaps a count of the records. We notice that the count of the records does appear down at the bottom of our screen, but we might wish to also have it appear in a worksheet cell, or we might also wish to average the numbers. And so there's a tricky thing about filtering. When we filter data, any physical actions that we take only affect the visible rows. But when we do math on the list, such as using the sum function is going to add up all those rows no matter if they are hidden or visible. It does not make any distinction there. And this is a situation where we do want a distinction. Perhaps I only want to see sales that happen in the city of Valdosta. So a worksheet function that I can use if I want to be more granular and only add up just the visible cells is the subtotal function. Notice the subtotal function is far more versatile than the sum function, and that's why its first argument is a function number argument. And it's going to be a number from 1 to 11 that signifies which function that we want to use. So if we use the number 9, that allows us to sum data, but it's only going to sum the visible rows. Notice we can also count the records. If we put a 2, if we said subtotal and then said 2 and then our range of cells, that would tell it to count the visible rows. If we wish to average the numbers, we could say subtotal and we could say 1 for averaging, and that would give us the average of the visible cells. The average function itself works like the sum function, where it makes no distinction between hidden or visible rows. So that can then be frustrating if you're trying to just get these ad hoc totals on the fly from your data. So let's go down to the bottom here of our spreadsheet, and whenever you're adding totals, you want to make sure that you leave at least a 1-row gap in between so that you then do not inadvertently filter your totals back into the list there when you do some filtering. So we'll leave a 1-row gap, and we'll start with the sum function. We're going to say equals sum. Let's say F2 to F51. And so that is our formula there. So it's adding up the sum of those numbers. Now let's contrast that with the subtotal function. So we'll say equals subtotal. And when we type the open parenthesis, we get a listing there. So you don't need to commit these choices to memory. You will get reminded when you go to craft the formula. Now, there's a second tier here, which is 101 through 111. If you wanted to include the hidden rows, then you could, but that's not what we want here. We want to ignore the hidden rows, so that's why we're going to use numbers 1 through 9. So we'll start out with the sum function, so we'll put a 9. Then it's just referencing our range like we would for the sum function. And so that's what our formula looks like. Presently, 2 different ways to get at the same total. But if we go to the data menu and we turn on the filter command, and I come along here and I tell it I wish to filter only for the city of Valdosta, and then I click OK, notice then I get 2 different results. The sum function is stuck in time. It's adding up all of the cells, whether they were hidden or visible. It makes no distinction, whereas the subtotal function is only adding up just the visible cells. If you wish to check that work there, if you select a range of cells down at the bottom of the screen there in the status bar, notice the sum appears. There's 214,041. So this is another way to just get ad hoc totals, is just to select the cells. But again, sometimes we want to include those on the worksheet, and so that's why the subtotal function can be helpful. So if we wanted to count the records, we could say equals subtotal and use the number 2, because 2 is for counting. Now notice there's count and count A. So in this case, we're going to count, because that's going to count the cells that have numbers. Count A counts the non-blank cells. So a little bit of nuance there. You could probably, in this case, either use 2 or 3 and get to the same place. But here, let's just use count because we're looking at numbers here. F2 through F51, and notice it counts those records there. Now, conversely, if I were to count column D, just to show you here, if I said equals subtotal 2 and said D2 through D51, in that case, the count function's giving me a different number. I'm not even clear why it's returning 10 there. So the count with the number 2 works with columns that have numbers. If we were to change this and put a 3 there, so we use the count A function, still not clear what that's doing there because it's still not doing the right result there. So notice the subtotal result, if you're counting, can give you kind of some strange numbers there. It should be just giving us in this case, it's counting 5 records because there's 5 numbers. That's what the number 2 does. If you're using it with words or anything, or using the count A function, you might get some mixed results there. So let's just clear that out and stick with what we have on the handout there. So the number 2, if we're counting a column of numbers, will give us an accurate count of those records. If we wanted to average here, we could say equals subtotal. And average is 1, and then F2, F51. And so it gives us our average there. Now, that is going to be a different average than we would get if we use the actual average function itself. Remember, the average function itself is adding up all the cells, no matter whether they're hidden or visible. So that's giving us the average for the entire list as opposed to just the visible cells. So for any of these, if we check our math here, notice we can get the largest value, the smallest number, the numerical count, and then the average there. So the status bar along the bottom lets you check your work with these worksheet functions.